Hey there, everybody. Hi there, it's Jay Frost speaking to you from the Philanthropy Mastermind series, and it's really a pleasure to have you back. I'm really excited about today's program and the person we're going to be speaking with and the subject. I'm going to introduce all that to you in just a second, but first I want to welcome you and encourage you to participate in this conversation. In fact, our guest is already doing that. So if you want to make sure you're actually a part of that conversation, since we cannot see or hear you, please do join us in the chat. It'd be a wonderful place for you to play. It's your sandbox, but it's also a place from which we can draw questions and comments throughout. So use the Q&A if you want. It's also a great place to ask something anonymously if you need to do it that way. But in the chat, you can just have conversations with one another, and you can do what Michael is now doing. So thank you, Michael, for warming up that space, and just say hello, maybe which part of the country or the world that you're from, maybe where you are located, what kind of organization that you're in. So thank you, Michael, from Hope from Bereaved in Syracuse. So good to see you there. I'm sure that's not just New Yorkers today, even though we have a somewhat New York focus, because the person that we're going to be speaking with will be able to speak to this whole topic of community foundations in general, since they've been around for 100 years plus, and her experience really does stretch across the field of philanthropy. So we're going to get into all that, but please do join Daniel and Michael in saying hello over in the chat. Of course, this series is brought to you by our friends at DonorSearch. I'm not going to be talking about DonorSearch today. If you've been here before, you know that I'm about to say that as much as we appreciate them, and we do, this series is all about philanthropy, and it's about you. So if you're interested in knowing more about what they do and about your donors, and I sure hope you care about them, especially during the kickoff to the giving season, you can learn more about them at DonorSearch's website at donorsearch.net. Again, that's donorsearch.net. And while you're there, you can also see programs from the last 2 years in the Mastermind series under the Resources tab, as well as on their YouTube channel. So check all that out. And once again, thanks to everybody, Karen and Matt and Christine and Lauren and Joe, and all these folks who are saying hello over in the chat. We really do appreciate you. Today, we're going to be talking, of course, about community foundations, and not just generally, but also the New York Community Trust. And the person who's going to be bringing some of that wisdom and knowledge and experience to us is Amy Freitag, the president of New York Community Trust. I'm not going to give you a big bio on either Amy's work or on the trust, because I know she's going to share that with you, but I will say a couple things quickly, which is that her experience is not only running one of the most important, I would say, community foundations in the country, both for what it does, how much it gives, but also how it chooses to interact with the community. But her tenure back at the Kaplan Fund really does speak to her experience and what she brings to this role. And also with transformative projects like New York Restoration Project, the World Monuments Fund, and other things that I'm sure she'll weave into the conversation today. We will talk about everything other than the University of Michigan. So with that, I want to welcome Amy Freitag. Thank you very much for being here today, Amy.
Thank you, Jay. What a treat to be here. And I'm so excited about all the folks blowing up the chat from Rhode Island and Michigan. We're lucky there are 900 community foundations across the country, and it's an incredible sector to work in. And I'm just grateful to have so many wonderful colleagues across the country, and grateful to talk about it today.
And if there's anybody here from Ohio, please make sure to mention that in the chat so that everybody feels welcome today.
Look, I think we just have to acknowledge that the big dance is on Saturday, and as a lifelong Ohio State fan, there's a little tension in the room with Jay, but we're going to work through it.
We will. Yes, I'm not wedded to that. I may even not watch the game. I don't know. Okay, that's a bigger sacrilege, I guess. We have a lot to talk about that has nothing to do with football or all these other hot button topics, but really about where we are in terms of giving in the country. There's a lot of concern about it. One place I don't see that concern aimed, probably because it seems like it just moves so well and so successfully, is the community trust movement and the ability it provides to donors of all levels to give, to be their best selves in their communities. Maybe we should start, though, at the very beginning. Can you give us kind of a little thumbnail sketch of what a community foundation is, and then where the New York Community Trust fits within that?
Oh, well, I'd love to. First of all, I think it's a great question, because what I realize is that community foundations they're not really a operating nonprofit, and they're really different than private philanthropy. So there, as a sort of different model, not everybody fully gets us. But here's what I want to say in the simplest terms: a community foundation has a two-part mission. We take in and we steward funds, both for living and also for donors who put us in their will for a charitable bequest for a community. And then we make grants. And over 100 years, we've made a lot of grants. We're approaching $6 billion in giving over that 100 years. So we have a lot to celebrate for our centennial this year. But that's this basic model where we're both home to donors, and we're also really interested in the nonprofit sectors where we serve. By nature, community foundations are place-based. So for the New York Community Trust, we are the 8 downstate counties of New York. So we start at the very north in northern Westchester and go all the way out to the east end of Long Island, but of course also representing the 5 boroughs of New York City. So that is home to 12.4 million New Yorkers. So it's a big, big task, but one that we are very, very proud to have been working on for this entire century. We're one of a couple dozen community foundations throughout our state, and we're working more and more in collaboration with our partners across New York State. So we just think of community philanthropy as just this incredible, I like to say that think of us as like this crazy quilt of generosity, each patch representing an individual donor's generous act. And then it's the community foundation's job to stitch together those patches and then create this sort of quilt of comfort over our region. And it's interesting because our donors, there is probably not a subject matter over these 100 years we haven't touched somehow in these 8 counties. I say we do from cats to cancer, from climate to culture. We make grants across the spectrum of issues. And it's really why I think people would choose to come to a community foundation, is to gain, the insights and value of being in proximity to all of that grant making to make their dollars go further.
There's a lot baked into that. And one of the pieces is for people who don't know New York well, when you talk about those counties, it's not just this volume of people, it's the difference of interests. I mean, you alluded to it, well, the C words from cats to cancer, but maybe it's helpful to have a picture of that too. That if people look from afar at New York, they might see, one thing, Manhattan or something. And that they might think, well, there's all this money there already. What do you even need this thing for? But that's not really an accurate picture of New York. So when you talk about that, all the different things you cover, what does that really mean in the life of people from Westchester to out to Buffalo?
Right. Well, it's such a diverse region, and it's true. I think when people think of New York City, they think of Times Square. But I could take you to parts of New York City itself that are saltgrass marshes, that are beautiful natural lands. We have, of course, Long Island Sound. Most of our counties touch Long Island Sound, so we have big environmental issues. And as you can imagine, you think of Manhattan as an island, you think of Staten Island. These are all places that are very, very prone to extreme weather and all kinds of events. Think of Superstorm Sandy as one particularly extraordinary wake-up call, I think, about the changing dynamics of our climate. We deal with affordability across this area. So one of the things that I think characterizes a place like New York and our region is that there's tremendous disparity of income. So affordability is a huge issue. How do, working class, middle class families persist in a place where real estate prices are always rising? So we look at affordability across this area. We look at climate across this area, very, very different realities. We are, as you know, an epicenter, always have been, for migration. We're the home of the Statue of Liberty. So the outcomes for immigrants that come to our region could be very different on the east end of Long Island than they are in the middle of Manhattan, based on a number of statistics. So we are looking at a wide range of different existence. We also have a big rural community in Long Island, agricultural work in Long Island, land preservation, historic preservation, and of course, we think a lot about health and well-being, physical health, mental health. So these are the issues that have very different profiles in different parts of that region. And that is why we feel really lucky. We work with, we have an office on Long Island, an office on Westchester, who work with really smart advisors. We have advisory boards in those counties really help us get close to the ground, understand what the needs are, and to meet both our donors and our grantees where they are.
And I'll bet those needs have changed quite a bit over the last 100 years. What's kind of the arc of that change in terms of your work?
Oh yeah, I think first of all, the community foundation really gets our start in the five boroughs where and we were just chatting earlier, the original community foundation the idea of it comes from Cleveland. And as a proud Buckeye, of course, I'm very proud of that. But this idea that there was a whole series of financial institutions in the city holding charitable bequests that they were generating revenues that needed to go out in the form of grants. And the banks and the trust companies were really knowledgeable about how to manage the financial resources to grow them, but they weren't so comfortable making the grants. And so the genius stroke from Cleveland was this idea that they would pool all those charitable proceeds and give them to a well-informed group of local citizens, people that knew about arts, people that knew about health, people that knew about education, and that they would be the distribution committee to make the grants on behalf of those financial institutions. So fast forward 100 years, the world has changed a lot, and we still hold that original trust structure that we replicated based on Cleveland's model, and then have grown a whole other sort of nonprofit endowment that goes with it. But that idea of that sort of beginnings of taking people's charitable gifts back to their community and giving them out. Imagine how the world has changed. The numbers of nonprofits that have grown in the regions that we serve, the needs of our communities have grown, the scale, the population, it's just grown extraordinarily. And what's great is that the community philanthropy has kind of grown with it. We've adapted over the years to try to meet donors where they are and to support this ever-growing nonprofit community that does so much to support our region. And I'll use as an example. In 1931, we had this wonderful husband and wife who knew that they wanted to leave the New York Community Trust in their will so they could do great things for New York. But they also wanted, before they died, to be able to make grants. And we came up with this thing called the Donor Advisory Fund in 1931 in New York. And can you believe in 2024, something like 200 million DAFs in the world, giving out just extraordinary amount of good charity to good philanthropy to nonprofits across the country. So the landscape has changed a lot, but I would argue that the community foundation's model has really evolved with that time to keep both that legacy of permanence and endowed gifts, and then trying to keep up with the next generation of generous New Yorkers, which is something we think a lot about in New York. What do we need to do to make that next generation have the kind of impact that the earlier generations have had?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to dig into in that, but the number is stunning to me, 200 million. I'm still kind of reeling from that. That means that a lot of people are able to access philanthropy
Mm-hmm.
their own way in their own definition, with very modest amounts. We talked about this a little bit before we went live. Could you describe what the floor is, for example? Not just what is the average, but what is the range of people who are taking advantage of this through the trust?
Well, this is what I really love about community philanthropy, that idea of that quilt, that there are big patches and little patches, and that everybody can have a patch, right? So one of my favorite permanent funds was left to us by Harry Rogers, a cab driver who drove his New York City yellow cab for decades. And then he and his wife, at the end of his life, left a charitable bequest to plant trees forever in the five boroughs of New York City. So after all that carbon was emitted, he's now forever planting trees to absorb that carbon and do good for New York. So we literally have funds that were created by cab drivers and school teachers and construction workers. And then we also have patches or funds that were left to us by Rockefellers and Schiffs. So it's that combination, but we like to think that the Community Foundation, one of my favorite stories, Jay, was a really wonderful donor who's worked with us for decades. I will call her Gail because that is actually her name. And she tells me, Amy, when I first started with the New York Community Trust, I had very little money to give. In fact, all I had was appreciated stock. And my gifts, therefore, didn't have commas in them. They were valued in the hundreds of dollars, not the thousands of dollars. But someone at the New York Community Trust got on the phone, patiently walked me through what it would mean to open a fund, how I could use this appreciated stock to build a philanthropic future. And decades later, Gail would say to me, Amy, my grants really do have commas in them now. But the idea that we can kind of meet donors wherever they are in that journey of philanthropy. So by having a minimum balance of a DAF of $5,000 at the New York Community Trust, you get to advantage yourself with all of the resources of our unbelievable grant making team, all of the resources we put out in terms of donor briefings and information. On Women's History Month, you'll get a list of all the great women's focused organizations, or on Hispanic Heritage Month, we'll do something great for all the Latino led and facing organizations. We try to give donors the resources they need so they can make the highest impact grants possible. So I do believe that community philanthropy can be really the on-ramp for people that cannot afford to have a private foundation, will not have a family foundation. And by the way, can give much more efficiently and put more dollars to work through a community foundation holding a DAF. And ultimately, hopefully, you'll leave your legacy with us too.
I love the way you were describing even those kind of monthly updates so that people are able to see organizations maybe they hadn't thought of before. Do you mind kind of taking us on a donor journey maybe? If we had set up a DAF, and I think this will be instructive not only for us as I would like to think potential donors, because as you just said, the floor is one that many of us can access, but also as fundraisers, many are in the room, they probably want to have a sense of, well, how can people learn about my organization? So besides those updates, those kind of focus areas, if I opened one today for $10,000, but I really have no idea what I want to give to, I hadn't been like the cab driver who knew he wanted to plant trees. What would I learn? What could I learn through the trust to help me in my philanthropic journey?
Well, first of all, our website is just a treasure trove of information, and we have a whole learning module within our donor portal that really provides deep access, all of our grant making over a long period of time, to be able to dig in and sort of see where our grants are going, in addition to these live and regular updates. And by the way, in New York City and in the 8-county area that we serve, if you want to give to hunger, I'm going to tell you there are like hundreds of organizations you can give to. And it's totally intimidating, right? And there's a great deal of fear. I think someone is going to make the wrong choice or make a bad grant. Well, first of all, I'm here to tell you that the Community Foundation is really here to not let that happen. Not only do we provide you a wealth of information, let's say we have a wonderful husband and wife couple that live on the Upper West Side of New York City, and they really wanted to give to hunger. And they were giving to some of the big banner names of hunger organizations in New York City, but their grants weren't that big. And I think they realized that my little grant isn't going to change the trajectory of XYZ organization. So one day they just picked up the phone and they called and they said, who knows a lot about hunger on your staff? Well, we have an extraordinary grant maker named Irfan Hassan, who has been thinking about hunger and homelessness. He's been working with the trust for several decades. And he got on the phone with them and talked them through their grant making strategy, what they wanted to achieve. And he helped them see that if he could give them to a couple smaller, less well-known organization, those dollars would be so much more meaningful on the ground. And maybe you could even get upstream of the hunger issue. So rather than waiting till somebody was food insecure, could we help get them to a point where they wouldn't become food insecure? Are there ways that we can affect the system further ahead of the need? So I have to say that couple just can't say enough nice things about the New York Community Trust, because they really felt like it transformed their grant making. And then in addition to that, when we do have an issue, and this one might be a little bit more political, you ready to go here with me, Jay?
Go.
You may know that we have for almost 2 decades been trying to come up with a congestion pricing strategy for New York City. And this
Oh,
is a very controversial topic, but if you care about climate, if you care about road safety, and just the reality of what it's like to work and live in a city that is pretty much consistently congested with traffic, the idea of giving a lot of public funding or generating a lot of additional funding for our public transportation system in New York City, which dates to the 1920s. It's really old. It's kind of fallen apart. So the idea that we could bring more resource to our public transportation, and maybe through market pressures bring the number of cars down in New York City, it's kind of a win-win situation for climate, for safety. So we started working on that issue 2 decades ago. So if you were an individual donor and you wanted to do something about that, oh my goodness, what do you do? There's a million different nonprofits. You read in the paper, it's this, it's that. Well, we've been working with a donor collaborative around this just over this past summer after the governor put a pause on our congestion pricing strategy. And we have a husband and wife who've never been that active in it, are in the middle of the donor collaborative. We have some of our largest private foundations in New York City that are resourcing it. We have just a whole range of folks that have come together, and they learn together through webinars and other modalities to get the information out. And then everybody can sort of decide how much they want to contribute, but they're doing it within a learning community, and it's a collaborative, right? So whereas if I love to plant trees like Harry Rogers did, I could maybe plant, I don't know, X number of trees. But if I could find all the other donor advisors around the New York Community Trust who love to plant trees, suddenly we have a little community of people planting trees, and my dollars are going much further. And then if we get Harry Rogers Fund, our historic fund in the act, we can plant a lot of trees. So it's this collective impact model. It's this community of learning and sharing. And it's being in proximity to our really good grant making team, all of which kind of makes that journey as a donor a really rich and wonderful and exciting thing.
It must be a lot of fun for the people involved too, because just because they're all New Yorkers, it doesn't mean they all hang out or shop at the same places. So if they're doing that, it must have this kind of catalytic effect, both on their grant making, but also on their community building, as well as on the things that they're funding.
Oh, I think so. I think it's like I always say, a great city or a great region needs a great community foundation because it really gets the community involved. And, you and I were talking a little bit about this earlier. I feel like, at a moment when our country, in fact, let me back this up a little bit. There's a great book. I don't know if you read Robert Putnam's The Upswing.
No, not The Upswing.
The Upswing is a great book, and he wrote this just prior to the pandemic, but it talks about a moment, and he opens the book with this scene around a moment of hyperpolarization, a lot of wealth gap, kind of a fractious civic commons, just people. And you, of course, think he's talking about now. He's actually talking about the Gilded Age and that moment where the society was really focused kind of on the individual pursuit of wealth and what he calls a great I moment in our society. And then he walks you through the pendulum swing by the mid 20th century, where there's very much less political discord, much less wealth gap, great investments in civic things like fully funding public education, like great things. And that came to be like what he refers to as a great we moment in America. And then by the end of the 20th century, the pendulum swings further back to a little bit less of a, maybe, not so comfortable in the working with government and other pieces. So I like to think that community philanthropy really is a demonstration of that we movement, right? Where we were coming together for the civic good, to come together for our community. So you and I may not agree on 5 out of 7 things, but if 2 of those things, or at least one of them, is our community thriving, we want a healthy and successful community, then there's a place for us to work together at a community foundation. And that community building aspect of what we do, I think, is a pretty important act at this particular moment, I would argue, in America.
Sure. Well, even the examples that you've given, from the planting of trees to congestion pricing, is all around wanting to make sure you have good air for yourself and your kids. And so how to get there, we may have disagreements, but if you don't get people in the room talking about it, I don't know how you can get there. So
right.
Clearly one thing that happens. What about the nuts and bolts of how the team at the trust then get a sense about what are all the organizations dealing with, whatever it is, hunger, for example? As you said, there are hundreds of organizations doing that. They all have different kinds of impacts. And so how are they doing all that research, and how are organizations able to, make sure that the trust is aware of them?
Yeah. Well, look, I think one of the things even before I worked at the New York Community Trust, I was a member of something like 5 of our donor collaboratives. We had a donor collaborative around what we call Go Vote NYC, which is just to get a higher voting percentage in New York. We have pretty low performing relative to a lot of other big cities in America. And we thought that that was something that we could all agree was not a good thing. And so we created a really great donor collaborative for that. Big donor collaborative around census equity and fair districting. There's a long-standing 4-decade-old donor collaborative around workforce development. So just really good groupings and times where groups come together to work together. So we have the wisdom of our peers in funding in that regard, and then our own grant makers. So we put out, so last year we made about $200 million in grants. $50 million of that 200 million came out of our permanent and endowed funds. Those grants are made by a really terrific group of about a dozen grant makers who work really close to the ground. In fact, we try not to bring people to the trust who've spent their careers in philanthropy. No offense to you and me, who've done a lot of that work. Rather, someone like, I'll use our wonderful colleague Chantella Mitchell, who joined the trust just about a year ago. Chantella has spent her career working in affordable housing for the city's housing and preservation department in the city. So she is really a subject matter expert in her own regard, comes to the trust with a wealth of networks, a wealth of experiences from the ground. So when we're making grants around housing with Chantella, we are really at the ground, at the grassroots with someone who's been in the trenches, really worked in that space. And that really is true across the board, whether it's in arts, whether it's in accessibility, in justice, human justice. We have folks that are public interest lawyers and folks that have been on the ground doing the hard work. So we like to think of our team as being well networked. And then we just learn and learn and learn. We are out and out and out. We do site visits. We're all over the 8 counties that we serve. So constantly having an ear to the ground. And then I will say that we also impanel a group of sort of civic leaders each year to get their insights, what's changing, what's happening. So our grant making team is informed by that. And then finally, really exciting, Jay, we're doing our first strategic plan in 100 years.
But
Yes, we are. We're just kicked that off in this past month. And a huge part of that process is a community listening, an open ear to our community through survey, through focus groups, through members of our strategic planning committee, to really get as close to the ground as we can to make sure that we are designing the community foundation for the next 100 years that really reflects the values of our community.
I'm just imagining that it's kind of surprising that there wasn't one that you had to revise. That means wonderful that you're doing it now and that you're getting all these inputs, but how do people respond at first? Do they say, wait a minute, how have you been doing this without a plan?
Well, look, we are standing on the shoulders of giants. By the way, I'm only the 4th leader of the New York Community Trust in 100 years. So it's an organization that has really benefited from extraordinary long tenured leaders, back to Ralph Hayes, who came from the Cleveland Foundation. And then a guy named Herb West, who ran it for about 25 years, and my incredible predecessor, Lori Slutsky, who was really a groundbreaker as a woman leading a community foundation in the late 80s, 90s into 2000s. So she really did an extraordinary growth of the organization. So it was in its own way on a very, very, very special trajectory when I got to the trust. And then the goal is for me, I think, to how to live up to my predecessors is what is our innovation? What are we bringing forward? So that's why we felt it was a really important time at our centennial, not to just look backward on all the great things that we've done. And there's so many good stories. I could go on for 2 hours on the stories of great things that the New York Community Trust has been a part of, but make sure we're boldly looking to the future on how community philanthropy can grow and evolve to meet the needs of a very dynamic, growing and evolving region.
When I think about the idea of bringing people together in a room to say, well, what should we do next? I mean, that kind of almost organic messiness sounds like a very positive thing to me. And I'm sure you found it to be, because you must have gotten lots of great inputs. But the output must be really challenging. So how in the end, first of all, how far along are you in that process? Maybe it's just the beginning, but then how will you, once it's complete, make sure that everybody feels like they're a part of that that plan. So they're all empowered to be a part of it, whether as donors or organizations benefiting from the trust's work. How can you get everybody involved?
Well, our hope is to really hold ourselves and visibly hold ourselves accountable for the work that we're doing. And we really feel like the plan and we are at the very beginning of this process. And I'm thrilled with the way it's launched over the month of November. But we should get back together. See, it's my excuse to come back to you to tell you how we landed in 2025. But I think our vision for this is not only holding ourselves accountable, but ourselves accountable to our community through really sort of an engaged process that doesn't end with a strategic plan. It really should start with that, and to keep people through and we've gone through a big rebranding this year and trying to make ourselves as visible and accessible as possible, and using our platforms through social media, through our various publications, and through our website, and how we show up in the world every day to continue to keep that feedback loop going. Because I think if you were to look boldly across the landscape of community foundations, first of all, over 50% of the leaders of the large community foundation group are all new in our chairs in the last 2 to 3 years. So there's been a pretty significant change within our sector just recently. Many of us succeeding giants like Lori Slutsky have been in their role for more than a generation. So I think we've all kind of challenged one another to say, okay, what is our contribution? How can we live to this promise of community philanthropy for the next century? So there's a lot of innovation happening in the sector. We are looking across the landscape. I think, there's always a sense that we New Yorkers know better than anything. Well, you know what? We have a lot to learn from our colleagues across the country, and that's also part of the strategic planning effort that we're doing, is looking kind of across the landscape to see where best practice exists. How can we learn from that and grow from there? So, it's exciting, it's dynamic. But I also think it's engaging and another great way for people to get involved with us. In fact, between now and November 6th, anybody who wants to vote on how we should be thinking about our spending in 2025 and how we should be thinking about ourselves moving into this next century of service, if you go to our website at thenewyorktrust.org, there is a place where you can click on our votes, our voices, our votes, and you can vote on how we're going to spend $3 million of discretionary dollars in 2025. And you can give us your vision for what you'd like New York to look like in the decades ahead. And we'd love you to do both of those things, because to us, the more feedback, the more inputs we get from our community, the better we're going to be at being the community foundation for these 8 counties.
Thank you for that. And Jack, if you can put that in the chat, if you manage to get that, that would be wonderful. We'll make sure that that link is there so those who are in the boroughs can participate in that conversation. That's really striking, because I don't know of, maybe this is happening in other places, but I haven't heard this before. Is that a relatively?
Well, I think there is a movement towards community voice and community engagement in community philanthropy generally, and I think that's just making our practice better and better. I think so it's interesting. I told you we made $200 million in grants last year. 50 million come out of our permanent endowed fund. The other 150 million come out of our donor advised funds. But of that 50 million that we get to spend, the reality is that about 3/4 of that is still somehow restricted by field of interest or some designation. So a donor may have left us money for cancer research. Every year we get to say maybe what cancer research it will fund, but it's for cancer research. We can't sweep that money away, even though there are going to be more people homeless tonight in New York City than ever before. We cannot take those funds that we promised a donor we would put to the cause of cancer research, and just because today we've got an urgent issue around a climate issue or affordability issue. And that's really the duty of care. We've made a promise to our donors that forever we will have their intent in our minds, and we will execute on their intent forever. And so that little quarter of our pie of the $50 million we get to spend every year is truly left to our discretion for the betterment of New York. And you can imagine when you have 240,000, oh, thank God, it's not doing it by a minute, 240,000 migrants moving through New York City over the past 2 years, or you have, any number of affordability crises, or we're worried about democracy in our voting. that discretionary dollars get quickly used up because no one died 20 years ago and left us a fund for climate change, regrettably, or no one died 20 years ago and said, I really want you to put money towards closing Rikers Island, our infamous jail. So if we want to move on any of those issues, we're really using that sort of small piece of our pie that's designated to our discretion. And what we're asking specifically, if you come to our website and vote, is how should we focus those discretionary dollars in the next year? And then by extension, with your vision for New York, how should we be guiding our grant making? And that I really do think will be kind of the feedback loop that goes into our strategic planning. So there's much to learn about a community foundation, but I think when people see our assets under management, they're like, why didn't you make me that grant? Well, the truth is, unless it's an area where somebody left us funds, we have limited funds to be able to address it. And our job is to meet a next generation of donors to create more resource to address the needs of today.
I love that. Thank you. And I have several questions on that. I want to just note quickly that Jack has put the link so you can do the votes in the chat. If you haven't seen that yet and you are a New Yorker, please check that out. Well, for that matter, check it out if you're not a New Yorker, because maybe your community foundation is considering ways to get that kind of active engagement. And whatever their process is, this may be one model. To do that, there's no reason not to have that conversation with them. I know that many community foundations, small ones, have avenues for nonprofits to come in and visit with them and learn from them, engage with them, figure out the best ways to not only make the donors to the foundation aware of their work, but also to learn how best to engage with potential donors. So this is just one avenue to be more educated on that front. And also, Christopher had a note here and a link in it. And Jack, we'll thank you for leaving that in. We don't usually leave the links in the chat, but in this case, Amy, he was referring to the fact that there's been an increase in older New Yorkers living on the streets, and that goes to the heart of what you were talking about. Lots of issues that maybe donors who are now deceased and generously made funds available, but might have designated those funds for particular purposes, couldn't have necessarily imagined the 240,000 new immigrants to New York in the last couple of years, for example, or some of the other issues that are more related to our times than before. And that gets to three questions. And the first one's kind of narrow, but it's something I've discussed with other people in the series before, and that's about the dead hand. That's kind of a horrible expression, but it's talking about, as you know, it's donors who have given something that actually you can't do anymore. And I don't know what an example of that would be in New York.
I can give you one. I can give you one. So I think I referred to a few superpowers of community foundations, and this touches on a key superpower of a community foundation, which is the power of variance. So let's say that Mrs. Smith left us a fund for the Charitable Hospital where she was born in Flatbush, Brooklyn. Fast forward with the modernization of our hospital systems, that has now been purchased as a for-profit operating hospital, and it no longer needs the charitable resources of that gift that she left behind. So the Community Foundation, through the power of variance, has this ability, if we meet a very specific threshold that is highly sort of monitored, whether it's practical. If a gift is no longer practical, there's a test. Oh God, I'm going to miss the test to be able to tell you. Is it practical? Is it prudent? Is it doable? Something like that. But there's a legal standard that we meet. And once we've met that standard, we could make grants to the thing that's just closest to what Mrs. Smith wanted by giving that grant to that charitable hospital. Maybe it's the federally qualified health clinic in Flatbush, Brooklyn, that serves a high-need population. That was the intent of her gift. We can vary the fund and make sure that that next closest recipient receives her generosity. So that is kind of remarkable. There are very few things where I think you can leave something for a purpose and know that there's a group of stewards who will make sure that that purpose is met generation after generation, even when the world changes in really unpredictable ways, right? We think of, I'd like to think that the nonprofits that I've stewarded over my lifetime will be there in 100 years, but there's every chance they won't be. But a community foundation will be, and the stewards of that funding will always make sure that those dollars are put to work in the way that they were intended by the donor.
So conversely, you might have occasions where someone wants to set up a fund within the trust, and maybe it's not something that you would be willing to accept. What are the guidelines on that front?
Yeah, I mean, I think we we have over the years made decisions where we did not think we were the best steward for the funds, and we're really honest with the donor if we think that's the case. Um, I think there are probably, for example, certain folks that want to fund in a very sort of, let's say, a religious cause that we don't feel like is really well served through our 501(c)(3) status, so we will direct them elsewhere. But I actually thought there are also really wonderful comments about the sort of dead hand where, magical things can happen, right? So in the 1970s, we were left a fund that was by somebody who had a real interest in medical science and wanted to leave us a fund specifically for blood diseases. Was very interested in the research of blood diseases. And so you can imagine there were a series of things that we would fund, and then the AIDS crisis struck. And once we knew that was a bloodborne disease, there was a certain radioactive, and I can say this because I was living in New York at the time, there was a somewhat radioactive quality of the AIDS crisis and philanthropy. It seemed scary. It was very, very, very political. But the New York Community Trust was working with a donor who is no longer alive, but had made a very clear position on what they wanted to fund. It was very clear to us that it was a bloodborne disease. So we made the very first grants for AIDS research in New York. And I'm going to say that's one of the things that we are so, so proud of. So the idea that a fund can become really important in ways that the donor maybe never intended, but could be at the epicenter of research around this extraordinary health crisis in New York. What an incredible honor for that donor to be able to do that work. And that's what a community foundation can do, is make sure that they're positioning their donors, whether they're alive or gone, to do the maximum benefit at really extraordinary moments in our city's history.
When you do have that sliver, I think you described it as of funds that are able to be applied to whatever purpose that you see as a need, you and your colleagues and the board see as a need in New York. Do you sometimes get pushback from the community because of things like you just mentioned with the AIDS crisis? For those who weren't living at that time, there was a lot of controversy, which fortunately I don't think we experience today, about AIDS and treatment for AIDS, but there was a lot then, and people were reluctant maybe to apply the funds. Do you sometimes see the community say, well, I don't know if you should be funding that, or you should do more of this other thing that you're not doing?
Well, I think that's one of the beautiful things about a community foundation is that we are a big tent, and we are going to have people on the full spectrum of political interests and ideas. But I think the fact that each donor has free speech through their funding, and they get to express their desires, and we are living out the free speech of our donors to get to do what they wanted to do. Just because donor X wants to do it doesn't mean that donor Y over there has to be in accord. It's a democracy, and that's kind of the cool thing. I think that's what's something sort of uniquely American about the form of a community foundation, that it can have such a diverse array of people involved, each doing what they feel is in the best charitable interest of their community. So there are going to be times that we do things that in fact, our team really loves to be early in a project. We're probably not going to be over the life of a project the biggest donor. Sometimes we could be, but what we like to be is sort of on the early edge of seeing an evolving need in the city and addressing it early on, or setting the table for philanthropy. We like to think that our grants, because we go through such a rigorous due diligence process, becomes almost like the good housekeeping seal of approval on a project that lowers the barriers to maybe other philanthropy that's not willing to jump in at the early stages. So kind of a little bit more like risk capital on certain projects and ventures. So whether it's the AIDS research, or we got in very early on a number of issues, including the raise the age controversy that went on, where we were still putting 16-year-olds on Rikers Island, which is an adult jail, and recognizing that that just wasn't a safe place for children. Even if children had been accused of really difficult things, it was not the right environment for children. So, it took 2 decades of constant pushing and advocacy, but that's the kind of work that we were doing early on, and I think we're really proud. Some of our most proud moments are when we took a pretty early position on something that maybe wasn't convention, but we helped blaze a trail for that kind of philanthropy to exist and to move forward.
There's a thing that we're talking about all the time now, and it's really appropriate given that Giving Tuesday is coming up.
Thank
Um,
you.
and there was, I guess, a decline last year in giving on Giving Tuesday by 10% or something like that. And we've seen the most recent numbers coming out of Lilly saying that there's a decline again in the percentage of people who give. It's on like 46%, even though the dollars are higher. And
Mhm.
the reason I'm mentioning all this is I don't know if any of that is impacting community foundations generally or at the trust. I'm wondering if you're seeing that because of the way that you were working with so many people, making this a big tent, that it is continuing to attract more people to philanthropy, or if you're experiencing some of the same kinds of counterforces or winds that are making philanthropy challenging today.
Yeah, well, I think there is, like, you and I also talked earlier about the fact that I think not everybody understands what we do very well, and I think our challenge is to make ourselves accessible and intelligible and really comfortable for people to get involved with. But I think in general, there's been a little bit of a negative drumbeat of late around philanthropy and this aggregation of wealth, and I think over the long-term trend, we definitely have seen some reduction of first-time donors to the trust. And that's really partly what's driving us at this moment of our centennial to reach out and really help people understand what community philanthropy is. I also think that larger number, fewer dollars kind of mirrors what we are hearing around the sort of me versus we moment and trying to get back to the bigger we. So this idea of us working and educating and engaging more people, and I'm going to tell you, I think there is such an opportunity to grow the tent of community philanthropy, and I think specifically around faith-based, right? So we have a long tradition of Catholic philanthropy or Episcopal philanthropy or Jewish philanthropy. And of late, we've really become more engaged with our Muslim donor community, which is quite significant, not just in New York, in Atlanta, in Michigan, in Detroit area. These are huge communities of faith folks that have maybe not traditionally seen community philanthropy as their partner. But man, we have the most generous group of donors in New York that are sort of the next generation Muslim donors. And they not only keep a DAF at the New York Community Trust, but they're doing a lot of direct assistance in the community and demonstrating through groups like that community philanthropy can help their dollars go further and get them more resources to do the best they can for their community is a really big opportunity for us all to grow. So it's a bigger tent. People who maybe didn't wake up in the morning knowing what a donor advised fund was, but can learn through a community of generosity like our Muslim community and find ways that they can do their giving through and for the community is kind of a fabulous growth opportunity. So while I do see, and you have to acknowledge these statistics, to me, I see nothing but opportunity to make community philanthropy in general more accessible to a much broader part of for our communities who maybe didn't think of themselves as philanthropists before.
Right. Well, even that word sometimes seems to be this kind of invisible barrier. And we do see giving circles, which I know are not the same
Yeah.
thing, but those seem to be growing and proliferating all over the place. Before we get into the last question here, I want to make sure I'm opening to the audience. And I think everybody's been waiting for me to be quiet and listening intently to you. But we did have a question earlier from Jane who had asked, and I think this is very helpful for the audience too, if you've ever found an effective way to strategically guide donors to give to your unrestricted funds.
Oh, well, we would, look, the New York Community Trust loves our Community Needs Fund. And, I do think there are folks that are just like, I just can't. I just can't. I don't know. I trust you. Here, give my money to a good cause this year. And we do maintain a Community Needs Fund. We have not done a comprehensive campaign for a Community Needs Fund. I know many of our peers do across the country. They do an annual campaign that is incredibly generous for their communities. So I think there are different models on how people have used their sort of combined fund. But when we think about the incredible outpouring of generosity around COVID, we saw a similar outpouring after 9/11 in New York City, where people came together and said, take my money and put it to the best use. Boy, have we demonstrated that the community can come together in quickly and effectively to lift a lot of resources quickly and let our grant makers go to work to make sure those dollars get to the maximum number of people for the maximum benefit. So we know that when called, our donors will step up and do amazing things. How we do that on a more regular basis and make our community needs fund really accessible and actionable for more people is something we'll be looking a lot at our strategic planning effort right now.
Thank you for that. And also thank you for mentioning your work during the pandemic, because it really hit New York in a big way. And somebody needs to thank you and your colleagues for all the work you did there. It's too easily forgotten as we move into the future. If there are other questions out there, I hope you'll ask them, because this may be your last chance. And before we do that, I want to mention two things. First, we do have a session coming up next Tuesday, because Thursday, if you're here in the US, is Thanksgiving, which means we won't be planning to eat stuffing while talking with you. But instead, we have a session on Tuesday with our friend Tammy Zonker, who's going to talk about how to ensure your donors and anyone else feel directly seen, heard, and understood. Very important. So that's again on Tuesday at 1 p.m. And we've also started, if you like listening to this sort of thing, and maybe if you need to drown out, a little bit of the noise during the holidays, you can put your earpieces in and listen to our latest podcast, because we're starting to do the interviews with the people who have been acknowledged by CNN as CNN heroes this year. So those started to drop last weekend. You'll hear those throughout, and you can also vote for your favorite CNN hero on the CNN website. We have nothing to do with CNN, but we always want to applaud people doing good things. So we encourage you to listen to those and give those folks a vote, just like we hope that you'll click on that link if you're a New Yorker and participate in the process at the New York Community Trust. So you can see a link to all that in the chat. Amy, I know one thing I definitely should ask you is something that they're not asking. I think maybe they're just being careful about it, which is, if you were a nonprofit and you really want to make sure that you were seen by the New York Community Trust or by a sister community foundation around the country, what are the 2 or 3 things that you really think they need to do to make sure that they are visible? Because we know you're all working hard, but there are a lot more organizations than there are staff.
Oh, yeah.
So what can they do to make sure that they're visible, that their work is understood, and that they're presenting themselves in the best way to you and your colleagues?
So, like many of our peers, we are loath to let any of our nonprofits waste 1 minute of time applying for a grant that they're not going to get, because that just isn't going to serve them very well. And yes, this is why my moonshot has been to double our grant making over the decade, because all we need is more resources to make more good grants. And so that's really kind of my personal moonshot for the New York Community Trust. But while we're getting there, what we want is every grant seeker to go onto our, I'm going to say, I'm very biased, but I think beautiful new website that has just a wealth of information for grant seekers. We literally have a thing that says, like, things we don't fund. Do not apply for those things, because we don't do capital, right?
Please
Just
read that,
don't.
everybody. Please read that.
Don't do it. So, look, and I have spent more of my career on the grant seeking side than the grant making side. So I totally get that, like, I'm just going to put it out to everybody. But the idea of really sort of using our guidance to make sure that the time you spend in applying, and look, we accept grants 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. Our door is always open. And so we really do encourage people, after they've read the guidance, to really put what they think, if they have a passionate project and it fits our guidelines, to put it out there. The greatest amplifier of our ability to make a nonprofit more visible is by us getting into the grant making process with them. And then we really try, like, to be that, I said earlier, that good housekeeping seal of approval to make that grant visible to as many people in the public as possible, to understand that we're doing this work, to our donor advised fund community. We really put it through a rigorous amount of work to make those grants. And we want that rigor and the value of what that grantee has put out there to be visible to as many people in our community as possible. So I think it's about getting into partnership with your community foundation. Whether you're a donor or you're a grant seeker, you should know your local community foundation. They need to know you, and getting into a really sort of meaningful conversation with them is critical, I think, because it may not be every grant, right, that you're going to get approved, but being on their radar and knowing that where your values align and where you're going to be able to find common cause is a great way to start being part of a larger conversation with the philanthropic community.
And is this as simple as, not only going to the website, and thank you, Lauren, for listing that of how to apply for a grant and what we fund, but also sometimes like here in Maria, Virginia, I believe they have regular meetings so that nonprofits can come and sit in and sort of be oriented. Do you have other mechanisms or other things you recommend, whether it's picking up the phone or what's
Well, the thing is, we realized that if our grant makers spoke to everybody applying for a grant, they would actually never make a grant because we literally have thousands of nonprofits and they could do nothing more. So we do encourage people putting pen to paper if it's a good fit based on, that's why we put so much effort. Plus we put literally videos with our program officers on our website so you can hear what they're focused on. The New York Community Trust works on a very long, the final one of there's so many superpowers of community foundations, but one of the things I'd like to say is that having worked in family philanthropy and now working in a community foundation, the time horizons for our work is significantly different, right? I found with a family philanthropy, it's an evolving conversation of focus, what they want to do, maybe over a 3 to 5 year window. We regularly work on a strategy that will be a 10-year strategy. So let me give you a very specific example. We were blessed to receive a big chunk of Brooke Astor's estate after she passed away. Great philanthropist in New York who had many, many favorite projects, but one of them was worrying about public school children in New York City and their ability to read. And we sat down with this significant amount of resource from her estate. And we looked, and the original task was to actually do tutoring. And we think, direct service and tutoring isn't going to change the fact that 75% of Black and brown kids in New York City read below grade level. So what is systemically happening there? And it took a decade. It took a decade of research, of direct service, of advocacy, policy work. A decade later, 2 years ago, New York City changed its reading curriculum entirely. That affects, something like 1.5 million kids in New York City. Not only that, but within a year later, the governor adopted the same new curriculum for New York State kids. So now we're up to like 2.5 million kids across the state. So that kind of slow, now we will not take credit for that alone. It was a bunch of grantees, but we can trace our grantees through that policy work over a decade. So that slow and patient sort of rhythm and taking on the tough, intractable problems and keeping at it decade after decade is what makes a community foundation really powerful. So we like to think that the patient capital, stick with it, take it on for the long haul is often the way to create the real system change that we try to achieve in our grant making.
Thank you so much for all this, Amy. Really do appreciate it. Such a privilege to be able to learn directly from you about this and to see what you're doing to make it not only so accessible to all of us, but right through the website so everybody can participate in this conversation. Yeah, we'd love to hear what happens after you take the vote. So maybe you can come back. But until then, I want to thank everybody for being here. Of course, thanks to Amy Freitag. You can see once again the link right there at the New York Community Trust. Check it out, follow their work. I hope I'll see all of you next week when we come back on Tuesday. In the meantime, do check out the podcast, would you? And there's a survey at the end here. And once again, as I've said many times before, the only way we know what you want to see and hear is your own vote. Your vote in this case is to fill out that survey. We really do pay attention. Let us know what you think and what you want to see in the year ahead. We're going to have a lot of programming. It's going to be built around your needs and interests. So go for it. With the name of the podcast, Stephanie, that is the Philanthropy Masterminds podcast. You can find that on Apple and Spotify, but also over on the YouTube channel. Thanks, everybody. We really do appreciate you, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Till then, take care. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you. Go Buckeyes.